Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we're very pleased to have with us Lyn Ford, who is a fourth generation, nationally recognized Affrilachian storyteller, a teaching artist and workshop facilitator with the Ohio Alliance for Arts Education, a creative writing workshop leader, and a keynote presenter. Lyn has published story collections titled Affrilachian Tales, Beyond the Briar Patch, and Hot Wind, Boiling Rain with Parkhurst Brothers, Inc. publishers. So we're very pleased to welcome you tonight, Lyn. Lyn is going to share with us Now Let Me Fly, Legends and Stories from the Paths of the Underground Railroad. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Lyn.
Thank you, Carla. And thank you for saying Affrilachian correctly. I can tell that you know how the word is pronounced, just like Appalachian. I was born into a storytelling family, and so it wasn't planned that this would be my career. It was my heritage. I'm very proudly Affrilachian, family of African American Appalachian heritage with indigenous heritage from the Cherokee or Salagi and Choctaw, as well as Scots-Irish, German, French, and English. And that's a story unto itself. As I grew up, I heard stories that sometimes I thought my father had made up. They weren't in history books in my school. They weren't in books that I saw until a great auntie gave me a small chest. She said she thought I'd appreciate it because I like to read. And in it were some very old history books that surprised me with information I had not known. They also carried information that let me know that some of the stories I thought my father had made up were actually legends based in some historical connection to the paths and trails of the Underground Railroad. Now, you can find maps of the Underground Railroad, and these days, more and more information has been discovered. More and more people are interested in this. More and more stories are being valued and confirmed. But my stories actually come from my father, from his storytelling gifts, and the gifts that he passed on to me as a fourth generation storyteller. There was a story that he told, and it would begin with a song, a kind of a spiritual. The words were, "Now let me fly. Now let me fly. Now let me fly way up high, way in the middle of the air. Way down yonder in the middle of the field, see me working on chariot wheel. Not too particular about the chariot wheel, just wanna see how the chariot feels. Now let me fly. Now let me fly. Now let me fly way up high, way in the middle of the air." And I love singing that with my father. And he would have me do gestures as we were in the car. He would drive and I'd do the gestures. And I think he was just trying to keep me occupied because I was one of those busy, wiggly, squiggly children. And whenever we sang Now Let Me Fly, I was to look up and put my hands way up high. And when we said way in the middle of the air, I was to point as if I was pointing to a particular star, which folks know was the North Star, which could guide people to freedom or the attempts for freedom farther north than the Mason-Dixon line. In the song are the words, "Way down yonder in the middle of the field. See me working on a chariot wheel. Not too particular about working on the wheel, just want to see how the chariot feels." My daddy didn't explain the song to me for years and years and years. But when I was a mother myself, he told me that the now let me fly meant now let me escape this place. I'd already figured that part out. Way up high did refer to that star that helped guide folks toward their freedom. Way in the middle of the air was north. Way down yonder in the middle of the field, my daddy said that in the family's history, there was a place with a stump and overgrown branches and thorn bushes, blackberries growing toward the middle of the field. See me working on the chariot wheel meant see me trying to escape. Only the ones who will help me should see me, because I'm going to hide way down yonder in the middle of the field. Not too particular about working on that wheel. The wheel, freedom, moving to freedom. Just want to see how the chariot feels. I want to feel my freedom. And so he was explaining to me that this was kind of a code song. Now, I don't know if it was a code song for everyone, but I got what I've shared with you from my daddy. And he would tell me a story about a young man who wanted to get away from working in the fields and not getting paid for it, from getting whipped when he didn't work hard enough, from rising before the sun rose, but for work that went on and on and on until it was too hot to work. And then perhaps you got to rest underneath a shade tree, but you didn't get anything to eat and you had to go back to work. And this went on until the sun went down and it was too dark to work anymore. Picking things in the field, baling things for storage, hard work that broke the back and the fingers and made the ankles and knees and backs and bodies ache. That young man wanted to get away, and so he might sing a song like the one my daddy gave to me. And if others started to sing it too, it meant that they were willing and ready to help in some way. And if they didn't sing, perhaps they thought it was too dangerous for that young man to try to escape. But if some of them sang along, they thought it might be a good time for that young man to escape. Now, Daddy said as he worked, someone might pass him in their work and remove the hat from his head, the hat that was supposed to shade his face, and give that young man their hat. If it was a young woman who was trying to get away, the bandana wrapped around her head to catch the perspiration would be removed and replaced with someone else's, so that she or he did not look exactly the same. Shirts and aprons might be exchanged so that the one that was leaving didn't look exactly the way he did in the morning when he came to work. And after a while, that one would hide in the middle of the field around that blackberry branched tree stump was safety. And then when it was dark and folks were going back to their places to rest, I won't say home because it was just shelter from the rain and they couldn't own the property, nor could they fix it up in any way. But as they walked past the foreman, he probably didn't bother to count. Everyone was leaving the field, except for one, way down yonder in the middle of the field. And when everything was silent, maybe just a few lightning bugs dotting the air, that one would start to make his way toward freedom, following that northern star, making his way perhaps toward the River Jordan, which was actually the Ohio River, and crossing the river in some way, sometimes wading in the water. For in the 1800s, if you check the weather information, sometimes the Ohio River was so shallow that at certain points you could wade across it. Perhaps that young man waded across the river. Perhaps there was a ferry that helped him to cross. Perhaps there was a canoe, some small boat waiting, and he would get to the other side. And that wasn't necessarily freedom. It was just the hope of it. My daddy would tell me things like that, and I didn't realize what an education he was giving me. And even though there might not be dates or specific names with the story, my father was giving me information about the Underground Railroad. And I wished I had listened harder, and I wished that I had learned more, but he gave me so much. One story I could check a little bit. It was about a young man by the name of Josephus. Now, that wouldn't have been that young man's name had he been born in West Africa and been given the names of his family's birth names for their babies. But he had been called Josephus, and when he was about 10 years old, he was sold to a man who ran the ferry across the Ohio River down in the area of Marietta. Now, this was before there was West Virginia. There was Virginia in those days. And that young man was to work for the ferryman without getting paid, without being praised for his work. Now, remember, I said Josephus was about 10 years old. That's about the same age I was when my daddy gave me this story. And he gave me this story because I'd been called a name in school, a name that I didn't understand. And I had been told that I was stupid, even though I was in what would now be called the gifted class. Daddy said that Josephus said to the ferryman one day, "Sir, I've been watching the way you make the ferry go. I can see that when the water's kind of low, you pull out the pole and you pole it across the water. I can see how you pull the rope to draw it across the water at other times, and I could make the ferry go. I know how to pole it. I know how to pull it. And if you let me do the work, you won't have to work so hard." Daddy said the ferryman told Josephus, "No, because you're too stupid to know what to do. So you do what I tell you to do. You help folks get on the ferry. You put their bags on the ferry. You help them off on the other side. You put their bags on the other side. Just do what I tell you to do. You're too stupid to know how to do anything else." And Josephus, a boy of maybe 10 years in age, felt sad and put his head down. 5 years passed, my daddy said. Josephus was a teenager. He was bigger, he was stronger, and Daddy always said, and he looked good. And he said to the ferryman, "Sir, I'm strong enough to make the ferry go by myself. And if you let me do the work, you don't have to do so much. I know how to pole it. I know how to pull it. I could make the ferry go and you could get a rest." And the ferryman said, "No, you're too stupid to know what to do. You just do what I tell you to do. You help folks get on the ferry. You put their bags on the ferry. You help them off on the other side. You put their bags off on the other side. Do what I tell you to do, because you're too stupid to know how to do anything else." And Daddy said that Josephus balled up his fists, but he just put his head down. 5 more years passed, 5 more years, and Josephus was a full-grown man. And he said to the ferryman one day, "Sir, you getting kind of old, and I can tell you're tired. And I could do the work. You wouldn't even have to be on the ferry. You could go ahead and take the naps you like to take under that tree over there. I know how to make the ferry go. I know how to pole it. I know how to pull it. Why, you don't even have to be on it. You can take your rest. You know what the ferryman said? No, you too stupid to know what to do. You do what I tell you to do. You help folks get on the ferry. You put their bags on the ferry. You help them off on the other side. You put their bags off on the other side. You do what I tell you to do because you're too stupid to know how to do anything else. And my daddy said by that time, Josephus could have knocked that man out. But he knew that if he did anything to the ferryman, there were others who might be hurt just because of the ferryman's anger. Josephus would be hurt too, but that didn't matter as much as somebody else being hurt because of him. So he just let his anger go and he put his head down. Daddy said not long after that, the ferryman was asleep under that tree where he liked to take a rest. And along the banks of the river came a man who was an abolitionist. And he walked up to Josephus, respecting him enough to call him by his name, not by an adjective. Josephus, he said, I'm here to help you get your freedom. I can help you take this ferry across to the other side. And there you can get to Marietta. And from Marietta, you can go on up toward Lake Erie and find your freedom. Josephus, why do you just stand here? If you can't get the ferry to go by yourself, I'll help you. Or maybe you can do the work and be free. And Josephus said, no, sir, you see, I have to stay here because I'm too stupid to know what to do. At least that's what that man sleep underneath that tree keeps telling me. But at night, when it gets dark, I must get a little bit smarter because I've been helping folks run away across this here part of the river since I was 10 years old. And that man, he ain't caught me yet. So he calls me what he wants to call me. I know who I am. I am Josephus. And someday, when I think I've done enough, someday, when the time is right, I'll take the ferry across the river myself and be free. That's what happened, my daddy said. One morning, the ferryman woke up, walked toward the ferry, saw the ferry on the other side of the Ohio River, on the Ohio side, the side toward freedom. And Josephus went from there on into the rest of his story. I love that story, absolutely loved it. And when I was in my 30s, I was doing some research on other stories. And I found the work of Mr. Henry Robert Burke in Marietta, Ohio. He ran a small underground railroad museum whose displays are now part of the larger museum there in Marietta. And he had a story about the ferryman. And the ferryman was a code name for a man by the name of Josephus, who helped people to escape across the Ohio River in the times of the Underground Railroad. I cried because here was my father's story, and it wasn't something that he had made up. It was a legend based in history from the times of the Underground Railroad. And I am grateful that Mr. Burke had made notes about that and written about that. But I'm even more grateful for what my father taught me through the story. He said to me that I should remember the story. When I was feeling low, when things weren't going well in school, that I should remember that an adjective like stupid is not your name. Now, that was one of my favorite stories from the ones that my daddy told me. And I don't have all kinds of dates. I'm not good with remembering the dates of things, but I'm great at remembering the stories. And that's why I can give them to you. There was another story my daddy told me about a woman who also helped folks escape. No, it was not Harriet Tubman. People don't realize sometimes that she was not the only woman conductor on the Underground Railroad. And most people don't know that many of those working for the Underground Railroad were African American. But this woman worked in the area of Kentucky and on the other side in Ohio, because sometimes when people would make it to the Ohio side, those who called them property would come after them and try and take them back. And sometimes they would succeed and sometimes they did not. But at this particular moment, someone had been brought back across the Ohio River, a father. And he didn't want to try to escape again, although the work was hard and his life was hard. He'd been permitted to have a wife, permitted. And they had a child, their firstborn child. And he was told that if he ever tried to escape again, his wife would be sold and the baby would be killed. So he wasn't trying to run away anywhere unless he could take his wife and child with him. And along came a woman. She was known to walk the roads and look around. She would carry bundles as if she was working for someone, but no one seemed to know whose property she was. And no one seemed to know where she came from. And she seemed to be around that particular land where the man and his wife and child were. And the one who called them property, he shouted out to her, "I don't know your name, but I know who you are and I know what you tried to do. Don't you dare try to help anybody get away from here. If you do, I'll beat him. I'll kill him, and then I'll come after you." And Daddy said that the woman just stood there, the way some grandmothers do. When someone says something they don't particularly care for, she just stood there and looked at that man. And then she said, "Well, that wasn't really my plan, to help someone escape. I thought perhaps I could help a few." Now that was bold. And that man got angry and he stepped down as if he was going to come after that woman. But she gave him that look. And he said to her, "Not one will leave here unless I let them go. Not one will get away from here." She said, "Well, because you said that, quite a few will get away from here. In fact, they will be gone in the morning. They won't be gone in the morning. They'll be working in the fields. I'll have them out there working 6 o'clock in the morning. Everybody will be working. And if they don't work, they will be beaten. And if you come near them, you will be beaten to death. And the woman didn't seem upset about any of that. She said 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. And the man laughed. I don't know why you're saying that. Are you trying to figure out when 6 o'clock is? Because I know you and your kind don't know anything about clocks. 6 o'clock, she said. And she started walking down the road, humming a little tune, and some in the fields hummed along with her. Well, then the plantation owner sent a message. He had a little boy come and get it. He wrote a note to the foreman. He said to that little boy, you make sure the foreman gets this message. Now the message said, get everybody up early. Have them out in the fields before 6 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Make sure they're already working so you can keep an eye on every one of them. After a while, the little boy came back. Did you give that message I gave you? Did you give that note? Yes, sir, said the little boy. And the plantation owner felt satisfied. Well, the next morning, plantation owner got up, about 7 o'clock. He wasn't worried about anything. Everybody would be out in the fields, foreman watching over him with a big old gun and a whip if necessary. But nobody would dare not work, he thought. And as he got himself ready, the foreman came to the house. Everybody working? No, sir, said the foreman. Why not? Ain't nobody there. See, I went to get him about 4:30 this morning, and there wasn't a soul around. There was just this note. Well, the plantation owner took the note and he read, I must tell you that some of us can read. And I read this note. I must also tell you that most of us can also tell time. So I made sure everyone was gone at 3 o'clock in the morning, including the little boy who let me read your note. Now, that was the end of the work on that land and the end of the promise of any wealth for that plantation owner. And because of that, well, that's the end of the story. Now, this story, as far as I can tell, is a legend because rarely did large groups of people try to escape all at the same time. It was dangerous, but there were times when a man or a woman might manage to help her family to escape. And Harriet Tubman was responsible for many of those possibilities, leading to hope and the promise of a better future. But as I said, Harriet Tubman was not the only conductor on the Underground Railroad. There's something to be said for being able to tell time and for knowing how to read. There was a little girl who maybe she wasn't reading yet, or perhaps wasn't reading well, but she'd been an abolitionist since her birth. Her father was David Putnam Jr. in Marietta, Ohio, one who fought for freedom, sometimes fought with his fists for the freedom of others. And his home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now, Mrs. Putnam was about to have a baby. And in those days, of course, you didn't go to a hospital. The doctor would come to you, if possible. And Mrs. Putnam was struggling. That baby was about to be born. Oh, she was struggling. And David Putnam Jr. was worried for her. There were troublesome folks outside the house, standing around, yelling and screaming and shouting, not at David Putnam himself, not at Mrs. Putnam herself, but at the one who was hiding in the Putnam's home, waiting for a conductor to guide him to the next stop on his journey on the Underground Railroad. He was hidden in that home, and he was safe because no one dared to break through the door. I told you David Putnam sometimes used his fists. And he had the door closed tightly, but people were outside yelling and shouting, "Send that man out here. We don't need that kind of trouble here. Folks are looking for him, and we've heard tell that you've got him hidden there in your house. Send him out, and we'll send him back across the river." David Putnam didn't open the door, and Mrs. Putnam was having a troublesome time. The baby had not come yet. It was dark, and it was starting to get cold. And some say it began to rain, a fine mist that soaked the ones who were making all the noise outside. And some folks had sense enough to leave. It was just too cold for all this. But some stood out there freezing. "Send that man out here. We don't need that kind of trouble here. Send him out, and we'll make sure he gets back across the river." David Putnam kept that door shut. And the rain kept on falling a little bit harder than it had before. And it was getting colder, and folks were getting wetter. And some went on home, but some still stayed outside, yelling and shouting. When along came the doctor, finally, Dr. Joseph Cotton. He was wearing a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed black hat to keep the rain off his face. And he was carrying his doctor bag with him. And as he made his way up the steps to the Putnam's front door, he turned to those who were standing there, freezing, soaking wet, and still trying to shout, "Send that." Dr. Cotton said, "You all should be ashamed of yourselves. Mrs. Putnam is about to have a child, and here you stand making all this noise. Give the woman some peace." And he went to the door and he knocked on the door, and the door opened just enough for Dr. Cotton to squeeze through, and then it closed again and was locked again. Well, after a long, long time, the door opened again, and out came Dr. Cotton. The long, dark coat pulled tightly around him, the collar turned up, the hat pulled down against the rain, his head down too. And he didn't say anything as he walked down the steps of the Putnam house and through the few people who were still standing there and on down the road, never speaking, silently walking. And some folks thought, "Oh no, something's happened to Mrs. Putnam. Something's happened to the baby. I didn't hear a cry. Did you hear some child cry? I didn't hear anything. Something went wrong. And here we are out here making all this noise. And more folks went home. But some still stayed. Early in the morning, when the sun started to rise, there was a sound from inside the Putnam house. The cry of a newborn baby taking her first deep breaths. A hard, loud cry, and the people outside were joyful. Do you hear that? Do you hear that? And then the door to the Putnam house opened, and out came Dr. Cotton, carrying his medicine bag, but without his coat and hat. And people said, thank you, Dr. Cotton, for delivering that baby. Oh, that child sounds healthy. Is it a boy or a girl? Bye, Dr. Cotton. Thank you for what you've done. Goodbye, Dr. Cotton. Dr. Cotton? Folks realized that while they'd been making all that noise, the doctor had given the one who was escaping his coat and hat. And while they stood outside, trying to listen for the cry of a newborn babe, the one who was escaping had walked right through them all and on down the street to another safe house. They'd been standing out there making fools of themselves. But because David Putnam Jr.'s daughter, Hannah, waited until the sunrise to be born, she was born an abolitionist. Now, when she was a good bit older, it's said that she was playing in the house with one of her friends while her father was trying to get some work done in his office space. The girls were running around the house, playing hide and seek. And now it was Hannah's turn to find her friend. And so she ran into the parlor and she looked behind a chair. I found you. She's not there. She ran into the dining room and lifted up the tablecloth. I found you. She's not there. She ran upstairs and looked under beds. She ran from room to room. I found you. She's not there. Hannah ran back downstairs and opened a small door underneath the steps, a small closet door. And there on the floor sat a man with dark skin. And he looked as frightened as Hannah did when she saw him. She knew the kind of work her family did to help others to be free. And so she waved at him. And she closed the door. Then she ran to her father. Daddy, there's a man in the closet. And some folks say that David Putnam just said, yes, Hannah. Shh. But Daddy, there's a man in the closet. Yes, Hannah, I know. Shh. But Daddy, there's a man in the closet. Yes, Hannah, I know, said David Putnam. He's supposed to be there. Shh. He's supposed to be there? Yes, he's waiting until the sun goes down and we can move him to another safe house. And he will be safe here, Hannah, as long as no one tells that he's here. Shh. Well, according to the story, Hannah went on playing hide and seek with her friend and never once said anything about the man hiding in the small closet under the stairs. So as a child, Hannah Putnam was an abolitionist. It's amazing what people can do for one another. There's another story about something that would be sad in any era, a funeral. At a time when the bridge in Cincinnati wasn't finished yet, and a pontoon bridge had been set up for soldiers to cross, Union soldiers, at the time of the Civil War. And these people were moaning and crying. Some were praying. Some were just shaking their heads. And 4 strong men were carrying a box on their shoulders, heading toward some cemetery. Now, people of color were never buried in the same ground as people of European American heritage. The cemeteries were separate, just like about everything else. And so these people walked past one cemetery and they moaned and they cried and they wrung their hands and shook their heads. Some wailed, some simply touched their eyes. And when people saw them, they felt so badly because these people seemed so sad. They removed their hats and bowed their heads and let the procession proceed. There were women who brought out their Bibles and read Bible verses for those who were mourning so sadly. And the procession continued. There were some who were coming down the road on their horses, and they made way for these Black folks who were mourning someone who must have been so special, so important to them. Such a wonderful person, must have been a wonderful grandfather or grandmother, must have been someone whom they all loved dearly. Shh, keep silent, take off your hat, be still and let them pass. And the procession continued. It continued until it crossed the pontoon bridge. It continued until it got to the Cincinnati side of the Ohio River. It continued for a short distance from the edge of the water. And then the procession stopped. There was no cemetery there, only a bit of open land. But the procession stopped, and the 4 carrying the box, well, they set it down on the ground. And someone seeing that said to them, "You can't bury anyone here." And they started laughing and laughing until they were crying and singing and shouting. And they said, "The only thing that we're gonna bury here is slavery, because that's all that's in that box. On that side of the river, we were enslaved. On this side of the river, we'll be free. The only thing in that box was slavery. And we'll bury it right now." But it said they didn't bury the box. They just all moved as quickly as they could to people who were actually waiting for them. and preparing to move them farther toward Canada or up toward New York, up farther toward freedom. And some hid, and some stayed in that area near that open land. But wherever they settled, they felt the joy of being free. And that's the end of the stories that I'll share with you tonight. I hope you enjoyed them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Lyn. I do have a question.
Yes.
I used the word Affrilachian earlier in the when I was in your introduction. Could you tell our guests what that word means?
Yes. It's a word that was created by a professor and poet from Kentucky, who was the first African-American poet laureate for the state of Kentucky. His name is Frank X. Walker, and he created the word Affrilachian, which means Black Appalachian or African-American Appalachian, to remind people of the diversity of the Appalachian region.
Thank you. And I have one other question. I was so intrigued by your the role your father played with you learning his stories. Did he ever talk to you about how he learned the stories?
He would say sometimes, I heard this when I was a boy. He never said from whom, but I'm going to assume, and I think it's safe to assume, that he heard them from his father, who I never, well, that's a lie. I was going to say I never met him, but I was a little one, so I don't remember him at all. But it's my understanding that he was a great storyteller too.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I have a note here in chat. Thank you for sharing your gift with us. It was beautiful. And I have to concur. So thank you very much. Thank you to our attendees for joining us for tonight's program. And we'll call it an evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm glad you were with us.